My son leaned across the kitchen table and shouted, "We'll take care of your money, Mom, because you clearly can't anymore." He said it loud, like a verdict, not a suggestion. His wife didn't stop him. She just nodded, already standing by the window, as if the matter were settled and I was something to be managed, like an old appliance that still worked but made everyone nervous. I was 74 that spring. My hands were steady. My memory was clear. I paid my bills on time and still balanced my checkbook on paper the way my husband taught me. But none of that mattered once my own child decided I had crossed some invisible line where a mother stops being a person and becomes a problem. They were sitting in my kitchen, the one I had paid off 20 years earlier. The oak table still had the small burn mark from when Daniel was 9 and forgot a hot pan on it. I remembered yelling then, too. Not like this. This was different. This was not fear or frustration. This was ownership. "You're forgetting things," Daniel went on. "You double paid the electricity bill last month." I didn't forget. I paid early. Then the company refunded it. I told him that. He waved his hand like he was brushing crumbs away. "See?" he said to his wife, Claire. "This is exactly what I'm talking about." Claire finally turned around. She had that careful face she used with doctors and bankers. "We just want to help, Ruth. You don't have to get defensive." Defensive. I had raised Daniel alone after his father died. I worked 40 years in payroll without ever mixing up a decimal. I survived on discipline and quiet. And now I was defensive for asking why my son was yelling at me in my own house. Daniel pulled a folder from his bag. Already prepared. Already decided. "We'll consolidate your accounts. I'll have access. Power of attorney, just in case. You'll feel relieved, trust me." Just in case of what, he didn't say. Old age, I suppose. That convenient word people use when they want your chair, your house, or your money. I looked at the folder. My name was typed neatly on the tab. My stomach tightened. Not with fear, but with something colder. Recognition. I remembered my husband's voice years ago telling me never to sign anything I hadn't slept on. I remembered how Daniel used to come to me for advice, not instructions. Somewhere along the line, that balance shifted, and I had been too busy loving him to notice. "I need time," I said. Daniel exhaled sharply. "This is what I mean. You make everything harder than it needs to be." He stood up. Claire followed, already putting on her coat. "Think about it," she said, soft and final. "We're doing this for you." The door closed behind them, and the house went quiet again. Too quiet. I stood there for a long time, staring at the folder they had left on the table, as if it might start talking on its own. I wasn't angry yet. I was something else. Alert. That night, I lay in bed listening to the refrigerator hum and thought about the word take. They had used it so casually. "We'll take care of it. We'll take control. We'll take the stress off you." I had spent my life taking care of others. Children, a sick husband, aging parents. I knew the difference between care and control, between help and replacement. By morning, I hadn't made a decision, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. If my son believed I was no longer capable of understanding my own money, then the first thing I needed to understand was exactly where it was going. If you enjoy the stories here, dear, you're welcome to join our Patreon. There you'll find exclusive tales that never appear on YouTube, and new stories come out earlier than anywhere else. The link is just below. We're waiting for you. The next few days passed without calls from Daniel. That, more than his shouting, told me something had shifted. When he used to need me, he called daily. Now that he believed he had taken charge, silence felt acceptable. I went back to my routines on the surface. Morning tea, a short walk around the block. Crossword puzzles with a pencil, not a pen. But underneath, something had started working, slow and deliberate, like an old clock rewinding itself. I took out the metal box from the hall closet, the one with the stiff latch and the faded label in my handwriting. Important. Inside were documents I hadn't looked at in years. Bank statements, old tax returns, the deed to the house, insurance papers from when my husband was still alive. Everything smelled faintly of dust and lavender. I didn't panic when I saw how thick the stack of recent statements was. I didn't rush. I laid them out on the dining table in neat piles, the way I used to when I was still working, checking dates, amounts, patterns. At first, everything looked ordinary. Pension deposit, interest payments, utilities. Then I noticed transfers I didn't remember authorizing. Small ones, nothing dramatic. 200 here, 500 there, labeled as reimbursements. Household support, temporary adjustments. Temporary had been Daniel's favorite word lately. I told myself there was probably an explanation. I had always been fair with my son. When he and Claire bought their house, I helped with the down payment. When he changed jobs, I bridged the gap. I never threw it in his face. I never kept score. But I did keep records. Quietly. Out of habit. I pulled out my notebook, the one with the cracked brown cover. Dates. Notes. Conversations. I had written things down for decades, not because I was suspicious, but because memory can soften facts. Ink doesn't. That afternoon, I made an appointment at the bank, not with a teller, with a senior advisor, a woman close to my age, calm, with sensible shoes and eyes that didn't rush me. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't mention my son. I simply said, I wanted a clear picture of my finances and full statements going back 3 years. She nodded, as if I'd asked for a glass of water. When I got home, I found an email from Daniel waiting for me. Short, efficient. Mom, I spoke to a lawyer friend. This process will be much easier if you cooperate. We're only trying to protect you. Protect me. From what, exactly? From my own name on my own accounts? I didn't reply. I made soup instead. Chopped vegetables slowly. Let the broth simmer. I had learned long ago that when people try to hurry you into giving something up, time is your ally. That evening, I sat by the window as the sun went down, watching the streetlights come on one by one. I thought about all the years I had softened my voice to keep peace. All the times I told myself it was easier not to argue. I wasn't frightened. That surprised me. I felt steadier than I had in months. If Daniel wanted to take care of my money, then the least I could do was take one honest look at it myself, without shouting, without permission, and without apologizing for being awake. The bank statements arrived in a thick envelope 3 days later. Heavier than I expected. I carried it into the living room with both hands, like something fragile, and set it on the coffee table. I didn't open it right away. I made tea first. Old habits die hard. When I finally broke the seal, I felt a strange calm. Numbers have never frightened me. People do. Numbers only tell the truth you ask them to tell. I started with the most recent month and worked backward. Dates, amounts, destinations. At first glance, nothing screamed theft. That was almost disappointing. What I saw instead was something quieter and more careful. regular transfers to accounts I recognized as Daniel's. Some marked as loan repayment, though he had never loaned me anything. Others labeled shared expenses, though we didn't share a household. I checked my notebook. No notes, no conversations, no agreements. One transfer caught my eye. $8,000. Moved out on a Tuesday morning while I was at my water aerobics class. I remembered that day clearly because my knee had locked up and I sat out most of the session. No memory of authorizing anything. I kept going. Over 3 years, the total crept up slowly, like mold behind a wall. Not catastrophic, not dramatic. Just enough to be invisible if you trusted the person doing it. I trusted my son. That afternoon, Daniel showed up unannounced. Let himself in with the spare key I had given him years ago, back when it meant something else. "Mom," he said, glancing at the papers spread across the table. "I told you not to stress yourself with this." I looked at him. Really looked. He seemed irritated, not worried. That told me more than his words. "These transfers," I said, tapping the statement with my finger. "Explain them to me." He sighed, the way parents do with stubborn children. "I already did. It's just money moving around. You told me to handle things." "I told you to help me pay bills when your father was sick," I replied. "That was 12 years ago." He shifted in his chair. "You're mixing things up again." There it was. The sentence that ends conversations. The one that puts doubt where facts belong. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I folded the papers neatly. "I'm going to have an independent review done," I said. Just to be clear, Daniel stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor. "That's unnecessary. And frankly, insulting." "To whom?" I asked. He didn't answer. He just grabbed his coat. Before he left, he turned back and said, "You're letting paranoia ruin our relationship." The door closed harder than necessary. I sat there for a long time after he left. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. I felt something settle instead, like a final piece clicking into place. People who are doing the right thing don't panic when you ask for clarity. That evening, I called the auditing firm. The bank advisor had recommended. Neutral. Licensed. Expensive enough to be serious. I gave them my information. Signed nothing beyond a standard authorization. I slept well that night. For the first time since Daniel raised his voice at my table, I understood something clearly. If this was truly about protecting me, facts would protect him too. The auditor called me a week later and asked if I could come in person. His tone was polite, careful. Not alarmed, but focused. I recognized it immediately. That was the voice people use when they know something isn't small. I dressed neatly. Nothing formal. Gray slacks, a soft cardigan. I didn't want to look fragile, and I didn't want to look like I was preparing for a fight. I was going to listen. The office was quiet, all glass and neutral colors. The man who greeted me was younger than my son, but he didn't talk down to me. He explained the process again, even though I already understood it, then slid a thin folder across the desk. "We've completed a preliminary review," he said. "Before we continue, I want to be sure you're comfortable." "I am," I replied. My voice didn't shake. He opened the folder and turned it toward me. Charts, timelines, clear lines drawn where money moved from my accounts into others. Some were Daniel's personal account. Some were joint accounts with his wife. A few were unfamiliar to me entirely. He didn't use dramatic words. He didn't need to. "These transfers were not standard bill payments," he said. "They were discretionary, repeated, and structured." Structured. That word stayed with me. He pointed to a column. This pattern suggests intentional behavior over time, not emergencies, not confusion. I nodded slowly. My chest felt tight, but not from surprise. From confirmation, I asked questions, precise ones. Could any of this be explained as miscommunication? Was there evidence of coercion? Had I signed anything unknowingly? He shook his head. There is no documentation authorizing this level of access or these transfers. I thought of Daniel standing in my kitchen, telling me I was forgetting things. I wondered how long he'd been practicing that line. When I got home, my phone was ringing. Daniel again. I let it go to voicemail. Then Claire texted, "Ruth, this audit is extreme. Daniel is devastated. You're tearing the family apart." I stared at the screen, devastated, not concerned, not confused. Devastated. That evening, I made a list, not of grievances, of actions. First, revoke all informal access. Second, change account permissions. Third, speak to a lawyer about formal protections. I didn't write Daniel's name anywhere on the page. That was important. The next day, I went to the bank again. Same advisor. Same calm eyes. She didn't gasp or pity me. She simply nodded and started the process. Cards canceled. Online access reset. Temporary holds placed. "Someone may be upset," she said gently. "I expect that," I replied. By afternoon, my phone was unusable. Calls, messages, accusations disguised as concern. "Mom, what are you doing? This is insane. You're humiliating us. Claire is crying." I didn't answer. I sat in my chair by the window and watched a woman down the street teach her granddaughter how to ride a bike. The child fell. The woman helped her up, brushed her knees, and let go again. That's care, I thought. Not holding on forever. Not steering without consent. That night, Daniel came to the house. Pounded on the door like a stranger. "You can't do this," he yelled through the wood. "That money is for the family." I stood on the other side, my hand on the knob, steady. "It's my money," I said calmly, "and I am still here." He went quiet then. Truly quiet. And in that silence, I understood something painful and necessary. The moment I stopped being useful, I became unreasonable. The morning after Daniel came to the door, I woke with a dull ache behind my eyes, the kind that comes not from crying, but from holding yourself upright for too long. I lay still and listened to the house. It was quiet, obedient, unchanged. The walls did not lean in, the floor did not give way. Everything that had carried me for decades was still doing its job. I made coffee and drank it, standing by the sink. My phone lay face down on the table. I already knew what was on it. When I finally turned it over, there were 14 missed calls, 12 from Daniel, 2 from Claire. No messages from anyone asking how I was. Only demands, wrapped in urgency. The first voicemail was angry. The second was wounded. By the fifth, Daniel was pleading, his voice tight and unfamiliar. He spoke as if I had misplaced something that belonged to him. "Mom, you're not thinking straight," he said. "You're letting strangers turn you against your own family." Strangers. I had known my banker for 7 years, the auditor for 2 weeks. I had known my son for 50. And still, I trusted the strangers to be honest with me more than I trusted him not to lie. I deleted the messages one by one, slowly. Deliberately. It felt less like erasing and more like closing drawers. Around noon, Claire showed up, not shouting, not pounding. She rang the bell and waited, composed, as if she were coming to check on a neighbor. I opened the door. She smiled immediately, the practiced kind. "Ruth," she said softly, "can we talk?" I stepped aside and let her in. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one Daniel had leaned over days earlier. She folded her hands, took a breath, and began. "He's under a lot of pressure," she said. "You know how sensitive he is. This audit made him feel accused." I waited. "You didn't need to go this far," she continued. "Families handle these things privately." "Families don't move money without permission," I replied. Her smile flickered. Just for a second. "Daniel thought you trusted him," she said. "I did," I answered. "That's why this hurts." She leaned back, reassessing. "You're 74, Ruth. People will start asking questions if you act unpredictably." There it was, the threat, thinly disguised as concern. "I am acting predictably," I said. "I am protecting myself." Her voice hardened. "From your own son?" "Yes." She stood up then, gathered her bag. "I hope you're prepared for the consequences." "I am living them," I said quietly. After she left, I locked the door. Not because I was afraid she would come back, but because something in me had shifted. I no longer needed to leave it open to prove I was kind. That afternoon, I met with a lawyer. A woman my age, sharp-eyed, unhurried. She listened without interrupting, then nodded once. "You're not late," she said. "You're just in time." We talked about boundaries, about formal revocations, about the difference between generosity and obligation. I signed papers that returned my name to where it belonged. When I got home, the house felt lighter. Not happier, lighter, as if it could breathe again. That evening, I sat alone at the table and ate soup straight from the pot. I thought about the years I had spent worrying that if I stood firm, I would lose my son. What I was beginning to understand was this. I had already lost the version of him who loved me without needing something in return. The audit didn't end with the first report. That was something I hadn't fully understood at the beginning. Facts, once uncovered, have a way of asking for more facts. Patterns lead to timelines. Timelines lead to intent. I spent the next 2 weeks doing very little on the surface and a great deal underneath. I walked, I cooked, I watered the plants my husband used to forget about. And every few days, I met with professionals who spoke to me plainly and did not soften their language for my age. The second report was thicker, more precise. Daniel hadn't just moved money. He had redirected it, opened accounts in his name for convenience, linked automatic transfers, categorized withdrawals in ways that made them look temporary, reversible, harmless. If I had signed full power of attorney, he would have been legally untouchable. That part sat heavy in my chest. I asked the auditor one question I hadn't asked before. If I had done nothing, how long could this have gone on? He didn't answer immediately. "Indefinitely," he said finally, "until the funds were gone or until someone else intervened." Someone else. Not my son. That evening, Daniel sent me an email. Longer this time. Carefully written. "Mom, I don't know who's filling your head with these ideas, but you're destroying trust. Families don't audit each other. They support each other. If you keep going down this road, don't be surprised if people step back." People, not him. Always an audience in his mind. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened a drawer I hadn't touched in years and took out my husband's old watch. It no longer worked, but I kept it anyway. He used to say, "Time reveals character." I was beginning to understand what he meant. The lawyer helped me restructure everything. Accounts separated, permissions limited, a formal trust created with clear terms. I was still in control, but no one could quietly move things around anymore. "It's not punishment," she reminded me. "It's protection." Daniel saw the changes within days. He called, furious. "You're freezing me out," he said, "after everything I've done for you." I thought about the doctor visits I went to alone, the holidays where he arrived late and left early, the years where my usefulness determined my importance. "You did what you wanted," I said calmly. "So am I." He hung up on me. That night, I felt the grief properly for the first time. Not loud, not dramatic, just the steady ache of knowing that the child I raised would rather lose me than lose access. I didn't blame myself the way I once would have. I didn't replay every decision I'd made as a mother. Some things are choices adults make, not wounds parents cause. The next morning, I woke early and sat at the kitchen table with the window open. Birds were loud. Life was persistent. I wrote one final note in my notebook. Not a plan, not a warning, just a sentence. Clarity arrived the moment I stopped asking for permission to protect myself. I closed the notebook and put it away. There was nothing more to investigate now. The numbers had spoken. The behavior had been named. What remained was learning how to live without explaining myself to someone who had already decided I was the problem. By the time the third audit summary arrived, I no longer opened the envelope with dread. I opened it the way you open medical results when you already know the diagnosis. Slowly, carefully, without bargaining. This one wasn't about money alone. It was about behavior. The auditor had mapped timelines against conversations, transfers against visits, withdrawals against moments when Daniel had called to ask how I was feeling, whether I was tired, whether I still felt sharp. I read it all with a steadiness that surprised me. There was a rhythm to it. Concern followed by access, praise followed by a request, irritation followed by a withdrawal. It wasn't chaos, it was choreography. I closed the folder and sat for a long time without moving. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because I was finally done explaining things to myself. Later that afternoon, Daniel came again. This time he didn't shout. He didn't pound on the door. He stood on the porch with his hands in his pockets, looking smaller somehow, like a man who had rehearsed anger and found it no longer worked. "I just want to talk," he said. I let him in. Not because I owed him anything, but because I no longer feared the conversation. He didn't sit. He paced. "You've made me look like a criminal," he said. "Do you know how that feels?" "I know how it feels to be treated like I can't think," I replied. He stopped pacing. "You could have come to me." "I did," I said. "You told me I was confused." For a moment, he looked genuinely startled, as if that memory had been filed away under something harmless. Then his face hardened. "You're choosing outsiders over your own son." "No," I said. "I'm choosing facts over fear." He laughed bitterly. "You think this ends well? You think people won't talk?" "Let them," I said. "I'm tired of living quietly, so others can stay comfortable." He looked at me then, really looked, as if searching for the mother who would eventually give in. When he didn't find her, his voice changed. "If you don't reverse this," he said, "don't expect me to come around as much." There it was, the final lever. I felt the old reflex rise in me, the instinct to smooth, to sacrifice, to preserve the illusion of closeness at any cost. I let it pass. "That's your choice," I said, "not a punishment." A choice. He stood there a few seconds longer, then nodded once, stiffly, and left without another word. That evening, I walked through the house and noticed things I hadn't seen in years. The scratch on the hallway wall from when Daniel dragged his bike inside during a storm. the drawer that still stuck unless you lifted it slightly. This place held my history, not his approval. I realized something quietly profound. I wasn't afraid of being alone anymore. I was afraid of disappearing while still present, of being useful but unseen, of being alive only in relation to someone else's needs. The audit had given me numbers. The confrontation had given me truth. That night, I slept deeply. No dreams, no rehearsed conversations, just rest. In the morning, I made a list of things that were mine alone now. My accounts, my time, my voice, my decisions. It wasn't a victory. It was a return. And for the first time in a long while, I wasn't bracing for the next call. I was listening for myself. The quiet that followed Daniel's last visit was not peaceful at first. It was exposed, like skin after a bandage is pulled off. Every sound in the house seemed louder. Every thought had more room than I was used to giving it. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I let it sit with me. The auditor called to say the final report was ready. Final. That word mattered. It meant there would be no more revisions, no more softened conclusions. Just facts, sealed and signed. I went to pick it up myself. I wanted the weight of it in my hands. The folder was thicker than the last one. Inside were summaries written in plain language, followed by appendices dense with figures. I read it all, even the parts that hurt to read twice, especially those. There was no legal ambiguity anymore, no room for interpretation. What Daniel had done met the definition of financial exploitation: repeated, documented, intentional. The word exploitation sat on the page like a stone. I expected rage when I read it, or grief, or shame. What I felt instead was distance, as if something that had been tangled inside me for years had finally separated into its true shape. On the drive home, I passed the park where I used to take Daniel when he was small. The swings were still there, freshly painted. I remembered pushing him, how he would shout for me to go higher, trusting without question that I wouldn't let go. That trust hadn't vanished all at once. It had been spent slowly, quietly, in pieces I didn't notice leaving my hands. When I got home, I put the folder in the drawer with my will and insurance papers. Not hidden, placed. It belonged with the rest of my life, not my secrets. That afternoon, I received a letter from Daniel. An actual letter. Handwritten. I hadn't seen his handwriting in years. He wrote about misunderstanding, about stress, about how things had gotten out of hand. He never apologized, not once. He ended by saying that if I insisted on keeping outsiders involved, he would have to protect his family. His family. As if I were not part of it. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. I did not tear it up. I did not keep it. I slid it into the shredder and watched it disappear in thin, even strips. That evening, I cooked for one and set the table anyway. A plate, a napkin, a glass. I sat down properly. I ate slowly. I had lived too many years treating myself like an afterthought. Later, I stood in front of the mirror in the hallway. The woman looking back at me was older than I remembered being. Lines where softness used to be. Strength where doubt once sat. I spoke aloud, just once. You did not imagine this. It felt important to say. I knew what would come next. Pressure. Guilt. Stories told about me in rooms I no longer entered. I couldn't control that. I had spent too much of my life trying. What I could control was this. I would not go quietly into someone else's narrative about my decline. I was not fading. I was arriving, late perhaps, but intact. That night, before bed, I locked the doors and checked the windows. Not out of fear, but out of habit. Care for yourself looks a lot like that, I realized. Simple, unapologetic. I slept deeply, and for the first time since all this began, I did not wake up wondering what Daniel would do next. I woke up thinking about what I would. After the final report, people began to behave as if a line had been crossed, not by Daniel, but by me. That part was almost predictable. When a woman my age stops absorbing damage quietly, the world starts searching for explanations that don't involve her clarity. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years called to check on me. A neighbor asked too casually if everything was all right with my memory. Even my church friend Ellen suggested gently that stress could make a person see things too sharply. I listened. I thanked them. I corrected no one. I had learned that truth doesn't need witnesses to remain true. Daniel didn't come back to the house. Instead, messages arrived through others, indirect, strategic. Someone said he was worried about my isolation. Someone else hinted he might seek legal advice for my own protection. It was remarkable how quickly concern turns into control when it's refused. I met with my lawyer again. Not because I was afraid, but because I was thorough. We reviewed everything: the trust, the revocations, the audit findings. She leaned back in her chair and looked at me for a long moment. "You understand," she said, "that you're within your rights to pursue this further." "I understand," I replied. "I'm choosing not to." She nodded. No surprise there. "That doesn't make you weak." "I know," I said. And I did. At home, I began to sort through things I'd put off for years: closets, old boxes, drawers that hadn't been opened since my husband died. Not in a dramatic way, in an orderly one. I kept what mattered. I let go of what didn't. There was something deeply satisfying about deciding without explanation. One afternoon, while going through old photographs, I found a birthday card Daniel had made when he was 10. Crayons, misspelled words, "Best mom ever," written too big for the paper. I held it for a long time. That child had loved me. I didn't question that. What hurt was not losing him. It was realizing he had learned how to replace love with leverage. That evening, my phone rang. Daniel's number. I answered. "Mom," he said, quieter than I expected. "This has gone far enough." "No," I replied. "It's gone exactly where it needed to." He sighed. "You don't see what you're doing." "I see very clearly," I said. "That's the problem." Silence stretched between us. Not hostile, just empty. "You know," he said finally, "people think you're confused." "I know," I answered. "And yet, here we are." He didn't threaten. He didn't plead. He simply said, "I hope you're prepared to live with this." "I already am," I said. When the call ended, I sat for a long time, not replaying it, not dissecting it, just letting it be done. There was a moment then, quiet, ordinary, when I understood something I hadn't expected. I wasn't waiting for an apology anymore. Not because I didn't deserve one, but because I no longer needed it to validate what I knew. I had proof. I had clarity. And I had myself. That night, I wrote a short letter. Not to Daniel. To me. I folded it and placed it in my bedside drawer. It said, "You did not fail as a mother. You simply stopped enabling an adult." I slept well. The next morning, I woke with a sense of forward motion. Not urgency. Direction. The kind that doesn't ask permission and doesn't look back to see who is following. For the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. The real work began after everything went quiet. People think the hardest part is confrontation. It isn't. The hardest part is rebuilding your life once you stop living inside someone else's expectations. Silence leaves space, and space demands decisions. I started with the practical things, the kind that don't look heroic but change everything. I changed my will, not out of anger, not to punish anyone. I did it because the document no longer reflected reality. It was written for a version of my family that no longer existed. Leaving it unchanged would have been another kind of dishonesty. My lawyer went through it, line by line, calm, methodical. She asked questions that had nothing to do with emotion. Who do you trust? Who shows up without asking for something? What do you want protected if you're no longer able to speak for yourself? Those questions stayed with me. I didn't remove Daniel entirely. That surprised even me. I adjusted, limited, defined. No ambiguity, no room for interpretation or leverage. What remained was something no one could twist into entitlement. I set up medical directives next. Not because I was ill, but because clarity is a kindness. I chose someone who had never raised their voice at me, never questioned my mind when it disagreed with theirs. Someone who listened. Then I changed my routines. I stopped explaining my decisions to people who asked with raised eyebrows. I stopped justifying why I wasn't fixing things with my son. I learned that many people are uncomfortable when a mother refuses to bleed quietly for harmony. One afternoon, Daniel's name appeared again on my phone, a text this time. "We should talk like adults. This standoff isn't healthy." I read it once. Then I put the phone down and finished folding laundry. I wasn't in a standoff. I was in my life. A week later, a letter arrived from a legal firm representing Daniel. Polite, cautious, framed entirely around concern for my well-being. They suggested an independent cognitive assessment. Just to be sure. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I called my lawyer. She listened, then smiled slightly. "That's common," she said, "and it's a bluff." "Should I be worried?" I asked. "No," she said. "You should be prepared." So I prepared. I scheduled my own assessment with a respected specialist. Thorough, documented, clear. The results were exactly what I already knew. Sound judgment, intact memory, full capacity. I mailed a copy to Daniel's lawyer. No note, no commentary. After that, the messages stopped. Not completely, but they changed. Less confident, less sharp. Power doesn't vanish all at once. It leaks away when it can no longer disguise itself as concern. I began to notice how differently my body felt. My shoulders dropped. I slept without clenching my jaw. Even my appetite returned, steady and ordinary. One morning, as I was watering the plants on the porch, a thought came to me so clearly it almost startled me. I was no longer living in anticipation of being corrected. That had been my posture for years, waiting to be told I was mistaken. Too emotional, too slow, too old. Now, no one was standing over me with that voice. Daniel had always said he was afraid I'd become vulnerable. The truth was simpler. I had been vulnerable for a long time, just not in the way he meant. That afternoon, I sat down and wrote out a single-page document. Not legal, personal, my boundaries. What I would discuss, what I would not, what help I would accept, what control I would never surrender again. I didn't share it with anyone. It wasn't a weapon. It was a map. That night, as I turned off the lights, I felt something close to gratitude. Not for what I'd lost, but for what I had recovered. My authority over my own life. It had been there all along. I had simply been taught to doubt it. Now, I didn't. The reaction didn't come all at once. It arrived in waves, like people testing how solid the ground was now that I'd stopped yielding. First came the soft attempts. An old friend of Daniel's called, someone I'd known since he was a teenager. He spoke gently, as if addressing a frightened animal. "Ruth, I hope you don't mind me reaching out," he said. "Daniel's worried. He says you've shut him out." "I've set limits," I replied. "There's a difference." A pause. Then, carefully, "He just wants to help." "So did I said, and ended the call. Then came the firmer pressure. A family gathering I wasn't invited to. A rumor passed back to me that I'd become difficult. A suggestion, from someone who meant well, that pride could be dangerous at my age. I listened to it all the way you listen to rain on a roof. Present, but not persuasive. Daniel himself resurfaced a month later, in person. He didn't come to the house. He waited for me in the parking lot of the grocery store, leaning against his car like this was coincidence. "Mom," he said, forcing a smile, "can we not do this here?" "I'm not doing anything," I replied, setting my bag down carefully. "What do you want?" He looked thinner, tired. For a moment, something like regret crossed his face. Then it vanished. "You've made things very complicated," he said. "You didn't have to go this far." "You keep saying that," I answered, "but you never say where I should have stopped." He clenched his jaw. "Families don't draw lines like this." "Families don't take without asking," I said. His voice rose. "I never took anything that wasn't for the family." "And I am part of that family," I said evenly. Or I was, when it was convenient. People were starting to look. He noticed and stepped back, lowering his voice. "You're going to end up alone," he said, not as a threat, as a certainty. I studied his face, the one I'd memorized in 100 expressions over a lifetime. "I was already alone," I said. "I just wasn't allowed to admit it." He stared at me, as if waiting for me to soften. When I didn't, he shook his head. "You've changed," he said. "Yes," I replied. "That's what growing does." I picked up my bag and walked away. My legs didn't feel weak. That surprised me most of all. That evening, I received an email from Daniel. Short, cold. "I'll respect your wishes, but don't expect things to go back to how they were." I read it twice and smiled, a small, tired smile. How they were had been the problem. In the days that followed, the world adjusted. Slowly. People stopped calling to fix things. Conversations shifted to safer topics. I noticed who stayed without needing explanations. I noticed who disappeared. It clarified my life in a way nothing else ever had. One afternoon, as I sat on the porch with a book I'd been meaning to read for years, a neighbor waved and asked how I was doing. "Steady," I said. And meant it. I no longer felt the urge to prove my sanity, my generosity, my usefulness. Those had been currencies I'd paid with for too long. Now I lived on something else. Self-respect. It wasn't loud. It didn't demand applause. It simply stayed. And when the thought of my son crossed my mind, as it still did, I felt sorrow, but not collapse. Love doesn't disappear when boundaries appear. It just changes shape. That night, I wrote one more line in my notebook, beneath all the others. They tried to frighten me with loneliness. They forgot I survived silence long before I found my voice. I closed the book, turned off the light, and slept without rehearsing tomorrow's defense. There was nothing left to defend. The hardest part of independence is not the paperwork or the confrontations. It is the quiet afterward, when no one is pushing against you anymore, and you have to learn how to stand without resistance. Weeks passed, then another month. Daniel kept his distance. No calls, no messages delivered through others. Just absence, clean and deliberate. At first, it felt like punishment. Then it felt like relief. Finally, it felt like truth. I began to notice how much of my energy had been spent anticipating him, what mood he'd be in, whether I'd said the wrong thing, whether I was about to be corrected, interrupted, gently overridden for my own good. Without that constant vigilance, my days stretched out differently. I took longer walks, not for health, for thinking. I passed houses where other women my age lived behind drawn curtains, their worlds shrinking carefully so no one would accuse them of taking up space. I had been on that path without realizing it, giving things up one by one. Control first, then confidence, then voice. One morning, I opened a drawer and found a stack of old birthday checks I had written to Daniel over the years. Always generous. Always paired with a note telling him how proud I was. I realized, with a small ache, that I could not remember the last time he'd said the same to me. I didn't tear the checks up. I didn't feel angry. I simply acknowledged what they represented. Love given without conditions, slowly turned into expectation. That afternoon, I went to lunch with a woman I hadn't seen in years, a former colleague, widowed like me, sharp-eyed, unafraid. We talked about books, about sleep, about how differently people treat older women who stop smiling on cue. "You seem lighter," she said, studying me. "I stopped carrying what wasn't mine," I answered. She nodded, as if that made perfect sense. Not everything was easy. There were evenings when the house felt too quiet, when I reached for the phone without thinking, when a memory of Daniel as a boy, laughing, small, entirely mine, rose up and pressed hard against my ribs. I let those moments come. I didn't scold myself for them. Love doesn't disappear just because respect arrives. But I no longer chased the past. One day, a letter arrived from Daniel's lawyer confirming that no further action would be taken. It was formal, neutral, final. I placed it in the same drawer as the audit report and closed it gently. That chapter was done. What followed surprised me most of all. I began to trust my own decisions again. Small ones at first. What to buy, where to go, when to say no without explanation. Each choice reinforced the next. I realized how often women like me are told that dignity is selfish, that boundaries are cruelty, that silence is maturity. None of that had protected me. What protected me was clarity. One evening, as I prepared dinner, I caught myself humming. I hadn't done that in years. The sound startled me. It came from somewhere unguarded. Later, I sat at the table and ate slowly, tasting the food, noticing the way the light fell across the floor. I was not waiting for a phone call. I was not bracing for accusation. I was simply present. I thought about the phrase Daniel had used months ago. "We'll take care of your money." What he had meant was control. What I had learned was this: when someone takes care of you by taking from you, they are not caring at all. That night, before bed, I stood by the window and looked out at the quiet street. My reflection in the glass looked older, yes, but steadier, rooted. I did not feel victorious. I felt aligned. And for the first time since my husband died, I wasn't living as someone's responsibility. I was living as myself. Daniel came back on a Tuesday afternoon, unannounced, the way people do when they want to look brave without giving you time to prepare. I saw his car from the window and felt no rush of fear, no tightening in my chest. just recognition. This was the conversation that had been circling for months. I opened the door before he knocked. He looked older, not aged, unsettled. His confidence no longer sat naturally on him. It was something he had to arrange. "I won't stay long," he said. "Good," I replied. "Neither will I." We sat at opposite ends of the living room. No tea, no small talk. I had learned that rituals soften boundaries, and I didn't need softening anymore. "I didn't come to fight," he began. "I came to understand when you became so rigid." I almost smiled. Rigid. That was the word people use when flexibility no longer benefits them. "I didn't change," I said. "I stopped adjusting." He leaned forward. "Do you have any idea how humiliating this has been? People talk. They think I took advantage of you." "You did," I answered calmly. He flinched, as if struck. "That's not fair." "I didn't say it was cruel," I said. "I said it was true." His hands clenched. "Everything I did was for the family, and everything I tolerated was for peace," I replied. "We both made choices." He stood up abruptly, pacing. "So, that's it? You cut me off, audit me, rewrite your will, and now you sit there like some judge?" "No," I said. "I sit here like a woman who finally read the fine print." He stopped pacing and looked at me sharply. "You're my mother." "Yes," I said. "Not your asset." Silence stretched between us. Thick. Heavy. He was waiting for me to soften, to add reassurance, to remind him I loved him. I did love him. That was precisely why I wouldn't lie anymore. "I don't want to lose you," he said finally, quieter now. "You already did," I replied, "when you decided I was easier to manage than to respect." His shoulders dropped a fraction. For a moment, I saw the boy he had been. But boys grow into men, and men are responsible for what they choose to become. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "I want nothing," I said. "That's the point." He stared at me, confused. "Nothing?" "No money, no explanations, no performances of forgiveness to make you comfortable. If we have a relationship, it will be one where I am not diminished." "And if I can't do that?" he asked. "Then we will have distance," I said. "Not punishment. Distance." He sat back down slowly, as if the room had shifted under him. "You've made this very final." "I made it clear," I corrected. "Final is up to you." He didn't answer. He stood, walked to the door, then stopped with his hand on the knob. "You know," he said without turning around, "most mothers would have forgiven." I felt something steady rise in me, not anger, authority. "Most mothers were taught that love means erasing themselves," I said. "I learned too late. But I learned." He left without another word. When the door closed, I did not collapse into the chair. I did not cry. I stood where I was and breathed. The house held. That evening, I walked through each room slowly, as if greeting them anew. Nothing had been taken from me in that conversation. Something had been returned. I understood then that reconciliation is not always the reward for honesty. Sometimes honesty is the reward. I went to bed that night knowing I had spoken without shrinking. Whatever came next, it would come to someone whole. After that conversation, the world didn't collapse the way people warn you it will when you stop sacrificing yourself. It adjusted, slowly, unevenly, but it adjusted. Daniel did not call again. Not the next day. Not the week after. His absence was deliberate now, shaped like a decision instead of confusion. I felt it most in small moments, when something amusing happened and my hand moved toward the phone before my mind caught up. I would stop, breathe, and let the moment pass. That reflex faded with time. What didn't fade was the clarity. I heard through others that Daniel had been forced to make changes, downsizing, selling things he had once bought easily, taking responsibility for expenses he'd grown accustomed to outsourcing to my silence. None of it ruined him. That mattered. I had not destroyed my son's life, despite what I had been warned. I had simply removed the cushion he believed was permanent. Some people were disappointed in me. They didn't say it outright, but it showed in their careful tones, in the way they spoke about forgiveness as if it were a duty rather than a choice. "You only get one son," someone said. I nodded. "And only one life." They didn't know what to do with that. I was not cruel. I did not speak badly of Daniel. I didn't defend myself either. I had learned that explanations invite negotiations, and I was finished negotiating my worth. One afternoon, I ran into Claire at the pharmacy. She looked startled to see me, then composed herself quickly. She said my name as if it were a question. "Hello," I replied evenly. She told me Daniel was stressed, that things had been hard, that families sometimes regret letting things go too far. "I don't regret protecting myself," I said, "but I wish him well." She searched my face for something, guilt, perhaps, or weakness. She found neither. When she left, I stood in the aisle for a moment, steadying myself. Not because the encounter hurt, but because it confirmed something important. They were still hoping I would fold. I would not. At home, my days took on a quiet rhythm. I read more. I slept better. I spent money without flinching, because it was mine and no one was watching to see whether I deserved it. That alone felt like freedom. I thought often about the word mother, how easily it becomes a role that consumes the person wearing it. How many women my age disappear into it until there's nothing left to defend? I had come close to that edge. One evening, I found myself standing in front of a box of old documents I hadn't yet sorted. At the bottom was a copy of Daniel's birth certificate. His name, my name, typed neatly together. I held it for a long time. Being his mother had been one of the deepest truths of my life. Letting go of the version of that role that required my erasure was not betrayal. It was survival. I put the certificate back where it belonged and closed the box. Later that night, I wrote in my notebook again. Not about Daniel this time, about myself, about the years I still had, about what I wanted them to feel like. Quiet, honest, unmanaged. The last thing I wrote before closing the book was simple. Dignity is not something you lose. It's something you stop defending for others. I turned off the light and went to bed. Outside, the street was calm. Inside, so was I. I am 75 years old now, and the mornings are mine again. That may sound like a small thing, but it isn't. For years, my first waking thought was whether I would be corrected that day, whether I would be told I'd misunderstood something, forgotten something, agreed to something I didn't remember agreeing to. Even before all this, before the audits and lawyers and silences, that weight was already there. It's strange how control often arrives long before confrontation. My life did not become grand after Daniel stepped back. It became accurate. I still drink my tea the same way. I still forget where I put my glasses sometimes. I still reread the same books because I like knowing how they end. None of that changed. What changed was that none of it was used against me anymore. Months have passed, seasons even. People stopped checking on my condition. They found other stories to tell. The world has a short attention span when an older woman refuses to play the role assigned to her. Daniel and I do not speak. I don't say that with bitterness. I say it with precision. We are not estranged in the dramatic sense. We are simply separate. That distinction matters to me. I do not sit around waiting for reconciliation. I do not imagine speeches I might give if he called. I do not prepare forgiveness in advance like a gift on a shelf. If he ever comes back, it will not be because I made myself smaller to invite him. It will be because he learned to stand without leaning on me. Some people still ask if I regret not handling things more gently. I always find that interesting. No one asks whether he handled things gently when he raised his voice, or quietly redirected my money, or told others I was confused. Gentleness, I've learned, is often demanded only from the person being harmed. I am not hardened. I am not cold. I am simply no longer available for arrangements that require my disappearance. There are days I miss the boy he was. Of course I do. I carried him, fed him, watched him sleep with his fist wrapped around my finger. Loving him shaped me. But motherhood was never meant to be a lifetime surrender of authority. Somewhere along the way, too many women were taught that if they did not endure everything, they would lose everything. That was the lie. I didn't lose my son because I stood up for myself. I lost an illusion, the one where love could survive without respect. What I gained was quieter and far more valuable. I gained ownership of my voice, of my money, of my time, of my name. I no longer flinch when the phone rings. I no longer apologize for taking space. I no longer explain myself to people who listen only for weakness. If you are reading this and you are somewhere between 60 and 80, and something in your chest tightened as you went along, I want you to hear me clearly. You are not too old to notice what is being done to you. You are not too late to stop it. And you are not cruel for choosing clarity over comfort. Care does not require obedience. Love does not require silence. And respect never asks you to vanish. If someone tells you they will take care of you while slowly taking everything that makes you you, your judgment, your finances, your authority, that is not care. That is control wearing a polite face. Look at the numbers. Ask the questions. Put your name back where it belongs. And if no one has told you this yet, let me be the one. You are allowed to protect yourself, even from your own children. If this story felt familiar, don't scroll past it like it was just another confession. Sit with it. Talk about it. Share it with a woman who has been told she's overreacting for far too long. Silence is what allows this to keep happening. And you and I have been quiet long enough.